Extreme social stratification was not really possible in a hunter-gatherer group. It is when you can concentrate wealth in a silo, or in land ownership. That's another thing that ag leads to. Higher populations means crowding. It means epidemic diseases. It has to do living in close quarters with domestic animals. Institutions of ownership are necessary for agriculture, and those in and of themselves lead to a lot of problems. And paradigms of control, like our very worldview, our very religions, have become kind of abusive, and that may be because of what agriculture started, where the way that we make our living is by abusing the land. It's the very foundation of our culture. So I want to clarify, agriculture is the growing of annual grain. I say I'm against farming, and people will be like, well, what about running cattle? And running cattle is different than what I'm calling agriculture. I would call that pastoralism. And different from gardening again. Those definitions in there. Okay, so we had 7,000 years of sustainability with plateau cultures. That was doomed to change. Like this says, this area was aggressively colonized in the 1800s. There were Indian wars. The wars were not as important as environmental destruction and disease in kind of defeating those cultures. And I'll illustrate what I mean by that in the next slide when I look at some quotes from Indian people. But we didn't replace them because we fought them. We replaced them because we destroyed their environment. We removed the reservations. All this stuff happened. So go to our quotes. So we talked about the chill workday of a plateau person. They didn't even think of it as work, according to one of their leaders, Smawala, who was a Wanapum guy, a Wanapum spiritual leader. He goes, "My young men shall never work." Never. In response to people asking them to farm, to mine. Screw that, I don't want to work. Don't make my people work. And here's what Mourning Dove says. My people did not farm and had no use for crops until the fish runs began to disappear. This is what I mean by environmental degradation, not open conflict, allowed us to replace Native American cultures. When the salmon run stopped due to pollution, even before the dams, pollution was harming the salmon runs, putting sediment down in their gravel beds. That made things scarce. And that made our way of making a living make more sense. Nobody wanted to farm until they had to. One thing I think that's interesting that Indians did take to immediately as it became available were large animals. They became ranchers, preferably. They ran cattle on rangeland, and they also loved their horses. And I think that's because that's a step back closer to our habitat. Our habitat used to have large animals. They're very useful to human beings. We have a long relationship with them. In a sense, there weren't many large animals. At the time of contact, horses and cows were a godsend. And the Indians really took to that. And before cattle, the Indians from here were actually making arduous trips over to the plains to hunt bison, so they could bring back animal products like hides and jerky. They liked that. That was worth it for them to make that huge trip. And so big animals, yeah, they said. Farming, no thanks. But eventually, that became the only option. Here's kind of the succession of our culture. We got the fur trade, right? We come in and we get some of the nicer animal products that we need for our rich people. The furs, the ivory, stuff like that. And then we start to explore the mineral riches. Then we move the cattle in. Sometimes before we move the cattle in, we have to log it. But in the early days, the wood was not always utilized. In fact, the Fruitland Valley north of here was logged so they could run cattle on it. But since there was no market for the lumber, they just stacked up all the forest and burned it. They wanted to raise cattle. There was no market for the lumber. Whereas areas like Seattle, where they had a port, they would log it, and then they'd sell the lumber to San Francisco, and then you could ranch. But then as the population stress became greater, the cowboys got kicked out, and the farmers moved in. And then after farmers, we get cities. Cities kick the farmers out. What's next? I want to know what's next. So the rest is history. I mean, the world here slowly became what it is today. We're in the nuclear age. We're wage slaves. The environment's very degraded. Our habitat's almost gone. And what are we doing about that? Mainstream environmentalism says change your light bulbs, get energy efficient light bulbs, take shorter showers, get an electric car instead of a gasoline powered one. Is that going to bring our habitat back? I don't think so. Another thing some of us are doing is waiting for a disaster to just come and end this all for us. Peak oil, we hope that oil will run out and force us to live differently. But will that happen? Here's Hubbard's curve. What has been predicted would happen. Here's actual oil production. And how long are we going to wait for that? Are we going to count on that to do our work for us, restoring our habitat? I think our solutions need to be bigger than that. I want them to be visible from space. You saw how our current land use activities are visible from space. The fields, the checkerboard forests, the urban areas, the solutions need to be visible from space as well. We need to bring big animals back. Those are a crucial part of our habitat. We need to perennialize the landscape. We need to say goodbye to this abusive annual agriculture, the grain crops, the wheat, the corn, the soybeans. We need to expand the savanna. And I think that would be good not only for us, but for all of these other species, these ghosts of evolution that live here that could use the help of megafauna to expand their habitat. We need to fix the fisheries. We need to take out these dams where we can. We're starting to do that. Condit Dam just got taken out on the White Salmon River, Washington. Beautiful. Look it up on YouTube. Before that, we took out Elwha. We're getting the fish back. And where we can't immediately take out the dams, we can make our own fisheries. We can dig ponds. We can raise fish for ourselves on smaller areas without the rivers. We need to foster population decline. And maybe one way to do that is to make more abundant the landscape and make everybody more affluent in the hunter-gatherer sense, maybe, so that we can kind of slowly come down. And we need to actively resist abuse. I don't know if any of you have read Derek Jensen's books, but if you do, you'll be convinced that we need to step in there and just physically confront the systems that are threatening our environment and destroying it. And that's more than wave of signs. It's more than voting for politicians or taking shorter showers. It's direct action. And interpret that how you will. Okay, so let's talk about some of those solutions. Here's an illustration of appropriate land use. And it's actually one that's pretty widely used. If you go to some of the valleys north of town, you'll see that the mountains are left forested. You'll see that people build their homes on the edge of the valley because they don't want to despoil the good grazing land that's down in the bottomland. And they'll also plant their orchard up there because that's where there's good frost drainage. It's a good place for growing trees, whereas the very bottomlands are a great place for raising animals because the soil is so deep. And when they're smart, they'll protect the riparian area, and they'll allow the stream to remain vegetated, and they'll allow the fish to exist in there, and they'll allow the beavers to kind of do what they do to reduce erosion. And this picture is kind of the opposite of the earlier illustration of kind of the nightmare situation that we've got today. That's what it could look like. You'll notice there's no annual agriculture here. We don't need it. We don't need grain. We're not granivores. And there's not a lot of like exploitive forestry going on, because you know what? The fuel, the wood that we need for fuel and for building materials could all be grown right in here. Be grown right where we live. We don't need that much wood. Hunter-gatherers rarely cut a branch any bigger than there are. There's just no need to. Forestry, as we know, is kind of not necessary. So this illustrates really well land use, and you can see the different zones. We've got our wilderness in the green and the brown, and the agriculture in yellow, and the urban in purple. Pretty impressive. Now that's a lot of land being used really heavily by us. So when I talk about expanding savanna, I'm talking about, see this zone where the forest kind of meets the agricultural zones and the steppe? I want to extend that transition zone. So right now, we've got the forest being managed by the timber industry. They're growing really thick forests, just really dense, getting as much wood per acre as they can. And then just downhill from that, we've got agriculturalists who are really reducing biomass, who are kind of taking the land back to like lower extremes of succession, where there's hardly anything growing for most of the year. So it's really juxtaposed. It's a really sharp transition. We ought to widen that, and we widen that by controlling vegetation, thinning it out, allowing natural fire regimes and animals to open up what's currently being used for timber production. And then lower down, we improve by planting trees and other perennial plants, and by supporting grasslands. There's no reason where that savanna zone could not be way bigger. There's just a handful of ways to control vegetation. If you want to expand the savanna into the forest, you use animals to browse it away. You can saw it away with chainsaws, chippers, axes. You can use fire, and you can use chemicals, which I think is a bad idea. The other methods will suffice in most situations, I think. Okay, so I've been talking about our relationships with plants and animals, and how we can use them instead of working ways to make our living. Which plants and animals do we want to associate with? We talked about this earlier. There are groups of plants. If you look at all the plants that we can grow in this region, it's confusing. We can grow like 300 different species of food-producing shrubs and trees. Where do you start? Well, you can start by splitting all those up into families, and there's only a handful of them. And the families all have similar ecological niches, and they relate with us in a similar way. The rose family makes fruit for us. They all have shallow root systems. They all need a lot of nutrients. They're all really desirable browse. Animals like to nom on them. The Oleaster family is made up of a group that really likes basic soils. They all tolerate drought really well. They all make a fruit that's edible to us. They all fix nitrogen. In the walnut family, they all have deep roots. They all make edible mast. They all have juglone. They all bring up minerals from the subsoil. So when we're designing our food forests and thinking about the ecological functions, we can think about it in terms of really big groups. And I mentioned the fig family a lot when we were talking about primates. Primates eat a lot of figs. Unfortunately, we're out of the realm of like real figs, but mulberries are in the fig family. And I figure since we have such a long relationship with them, they probably would be really good for us. Yeah, and I think if you're serious about restoring your habitat, you ought to learn these families, and you can see this list on my website. It really simplifies things. And I could go through and list, like, beech family, that's chestnuts, that's acorns. Rose family, when you think of what nut is in the rose family, it's the almond and the sweet fit apricots. Birch family, birches are edible? Yeah, because hazelnuts are in the birch family. There's custards family. Custard family, there's only one edible genus that's hardy here. That's the pawpaw. Chocolate vine family, there's just a couple. There's just the blue bean and the actual chocolate vine. I'll leave it there. There's a lot we could talk about here. And then you can do the same thing with forbs, the plants that aren't trees and shrubs. So if we're focusing on the foods we evolved to eat, our staple calories are going to come from root vegetables, a lot of them. And the natives and even our garden plants all fall into just a few families. So we've got carrot family has carrots, parsnips, ombre parsley, wild plants like yampa, biscuit root. Sunflower family, we got Jerusalem artichokes, balsam root, burdock. Lily family, there's a ton of them. Onions, camas, leeks. And they're all like that. And they all have similar ecological niches, and they all relate to us in a similar way within families. I want to talk about the plants out there that are coming to us. They respond to our use of the land. So all these species grow wild here. I've seen them all. And I don't just mean that nobody's watering them. I mean that they're like reproducing, that they can compete with native vegetation, that they hold their own. They don't need spray. All these grow wild. This is under the bridge, the I-90 bridge. That's a cherry tree. There's a lot of wild food down there, actually. And so we've got this system we make our living that's really abusive, and then there's these plants coming in and try to heal the damage we do. They come in where we disturb the ground. They come in where we pollute things, and they're just begging for us. They're like, hey, look at me. I can fix your mistakes, and I can feed you. And I can feed native animals. And in any urban area, you'll see these plants proliferating and nobody using them. Empty lots. So huge. We really need to take them up on their offer. They'd be good relationships for us to have.